To share with you a little anecdote that comes from Henry Bosch this morning. Seems there was a woman who was married to a man that she just couldn't ever seem to please. As hard as she tried, she just couldn't suit him. She determined in her heart she was going to work twice as hard to be a better wife. She determined that she would start the very next morning. So she asked her husband, "Darling, what would you like for breakfast in the morning?" He growled, "Coffee, toast, grits, sausage, and 2 eggs, 1 scrambled, 1 fried." She was up early and fixed exactly what he wanted, put it on the table. As soon as she sat down, she waited anxiously to see if he would say even maybe a word or two of praise. Whereupon he looked up and said, "Well, if you didn't scramble the wrong egg." I suspect we've all been around someone like that. Worse yet, I kind of expect we've all been a little bit like that. When we reflect on this little anecdote, we automatically feel sorry for the wife. We ought to also be sorry for those who are like the man who had the wrong egg scrambled, where they are very miserable, very unhappy, very unfulfilled in their life. Last week we discussed what we need to do in regard to the problems and the challenges that come our way. And we said that the greatest thing we need to do, what we need to practice on a daily basis in our life, was to make faith-based responses rather than complain. And so the 3 points of our outline last week were simply this: stop complaining, start praying. Remember, the people complained to Moses. Moses went directly to God. Stop complaining, start praying. And then the Bible tells us there in that section we looked at last week that the whole thing, the lack of water at Marah, was something that God had orchestrated to test them. So we need to always be obedient. You see, if things aren't right in our world, if we got something to complain about, then we usually manufacture at the same time in our heart an excuse for not doing something we ought to be doing. So we need to be making faith-based responses when things go wrong, when challenges come. Now this week, we're going to follow up. We're going to follow up on what we said last week. But what we want to do this week is kind of give you a little bit of a warning. This is what's going to happen if you don't apply the principles that we looked at last week. You're going to end up with a critical spirit. You're going to end up with a negative attitude, a negative approach to life. Constant criticism will flow out of your mouth. You will not be content. You'll end up miserable, like the man who sat down at breakfast. So this week is a warning, if you will. A warning of where you may be headed if you allow complaining to develop into a critical spirit. So let's look at chapter 16 of Exodus again. We come to a very similar situation to what we looked at last week. Now remember, last week we noted how God had led them by the pillar of the cloud and the fire to a place called Mara, where there was plenty of water, but it was undrinkable. And the people complained. It had been 3 days in the desert. Their water supplies had run out. They came and complained to Moses. Moses cried out to God. God said, take a branch off the tree, throw it in the water, and the water will become sweet. And that's exactly what happened. But had they learned their lesson? Well, let's look at chapter 16 and see. Verse 1. And they journeyed from Elim. Remember, Elim was the next place they went to after Mara, where there was plenty of good water. And they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. What did they say? Verse 3, and the children of Israel said to them, oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out here in this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. So this situation is not exactly the same, but pretty similar. In Mara, they were short of water. Now they say, well, we don't have enough food to eat. And not only do we not have enough to eat, by the way, I don't think they were about to starve to death. It was probably getting a little bleak, but they had a lot of herds and things they brought along with them, but they really got desperate. What they said was, basically, our diet's really poor. It's not like it was back in Egypt. And we don't have the bread that we liked in Egypt. We don't have the meat that we had in Egypt. And they had fish and all sorts of vegetables, all that in Egypt. It was a plentiful land until, of course, the Lord devastated it. So they didn't learn their lesson at all at Mara. So what we're going to notice, first of all, if you are leaning toward, if you're moving toward that stage where you're just becoming a negative person and you have a negative attitude and a critical spirit, the criticism is going to be constant. You're not going to like anything. Everything, pretty much, is wrong. In fact, that's your perspective on life. That's how you look at things, through that negative lens, if you will. The thing about being overly critical on a constant basis is you're right. This world is a mess. And your situation and mine is far from perfect. And we can find many things to be unhappy about. But that doesn't excuse us from trusting God and counting His blessings and being the person He's called us to be. So it's a very subtle temptation. What happens is there's a habit that develops. We mentioned this last week. Habitual complaining. Let's go all the way back to chapter 14. And in chapter 14, at verse 11, it says, this is right before God parted the sea, they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us to bring us out of Egypt? That was what they said before God parted the water. Then in chapter 15, when they come to Mara, verse 24, it says, and the people complained, saying, what are we going to drink? Right before God sweetened the water. And now when they come to the wilderness of Sin, they say, well, we don't have enough to eat. Now, what God does, we'll talk about more next week. But He sends them the manna, which they found on the ground in the morning to make bread from. And He sent them a tremendous supply of quail, as it's called here, a game bird of some sort that's native to that area that migrates through those regions. And God not only did that then, at that moment in time, but He did so for the next 40 years, supply them with manna and with meat. So, gee whiz. Have they learned their lesson yet? Let's go to the next stop. And by the way, I think we have a map here. You can see it. The first arrow, the top arrow, that's Mara. They traveled to Elim, just south of there. The green arrow, That is where they had the 12 wells, the 70-some palm trees. They stayed a long time, had a good time. Then they traveled down to the wilderness of sin, which is partially covered up by the Crimson era. And the place where they stayed at, we I believe is Dovka, or Dovka, something near to that, Dovka. That was the stop that they made, and where they complained about the food. And they moved then down to the last era, the black one, which we're going to see now in chapter 17, a place that is called Rephidim, chapter 17, verse 1, where it says, Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people there. Does that sound familiar? No water, no food, God supplies. Oh, no water again. Therefore the people complained. Now this time, God tells Moses to go to a rock, probably a very large rock, and to strike that rock, and when he did so, water came out and supplied them. On 3 occasions, they found reason to complain, but every time, God just bam, bam, bam. Immediately, as soon as they complained, God opened the floodgates and blessed them. But their complaining had become habitual, constant. By the way, it had become predictable. At this point, when you read the story, you just think, well, what's their next problem going to be they're going to complain about? But God, in a very loving, gracious, and merciful way, is trying to teach them. Now, I'm not sure they ever really learned the lesson the way they should, but He's trying to teach them. And their complaining, as we have seen it so far, is not only constant, but it's predictable. Let me give you the 2 ways to predict complaint when you have this problem of constant criticism. 2 words: change. Change. When your situation changes, you are susceptible to becoming even more critical than you have at that point. You will revert to the habit that you're in. You will criticize, you will complain, you will be negative in your approach to life whenever you're faced with change. And that's unfortunate because life is nothing but change. Oh, we like everything to stay the same, don't we? That's what gives us comfort. But God doesn't want us to become comfortable with the circumstances. God wants us to become comfortable with trusting Him as life changes. They're out in the desert. They've never been in the desert before. They've never been stomping around in the wilderness before. These people, although they were slaves, had plenty in Egypt. And they were, up until the last, when Pharaoh began to mistreat them, they were living a pretty comfortable life. They didn't know what it was like to put everything they owned on their back and go trudging out into a wilderness and try to survive. Change constantly prodded them into a critical spirit. I don't know about you, but when you think about it, I'm glad things change. I know. When you get to be a certain age, you begin to look back and say, boy, if I could just be young again. Let me tell you what. What we think is if we could just be young again and know everything we know now. The trouble is, if you're young again, you don't know those things, and you're going to repeat the same stupid mistakes you made. You want to repeat that again? I don't. And besides, the older you get, the closer you get to being with the Lord. And that's going to be one final change. It's going to take care of all the problems associated with life and its changes. So prediction number 1 is change. When things change about you, when things change at church, when things change in your home, when things change on the job place, when things change in your community, when things change in your country, when things change in the world, there's one constant: they will always change. Change, the first. Number 2, challenges. 2 C's. Whenever you're faced with change, and whenever you're faced with a challenge, that's when you really have a problem. That's when you've got a struggle going on. It might be health, it might be financial, it might be any number of things. You might lose your job. You might be faced with problems in your family or with your children. Change, number 1, challenges, number 2. And that's exactly what God gave to Israel here as they're moving through the wilderness. He gave them plenty of change, and He gave them plenty of challenges because God is trying to develop a people. So there's your predictions. There's what you watch for. There's the red flags in your environment. A critical spirit is constant, first of all, and then secondly, it's contagious. A critical spirit is contagious. Now, we're going to move past the first stop at Dopka, in the wilderness of sin, and we're going to come over to chapter 17 again, the last stop on our map, the last error down at the bottom, which is Rephaim. Let me say that again, get it right. Rephaim, chapter 17. Now, again, let's begin at verse 1. Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore, the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me?" Now, when you come on down to verse 5, when God gives them the answer, and when God begins to instruct Moses as how to handle the problem, look at verse 5. And the Lord said to Moses, Go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river and go. And even then, of course, he struck the watch. Why did God tell him to take some of the elders? Because not only had the common man trudging through the wilderness and got into a critical spirit, but it filtered right on up to the leadership. Except for Moses and Aaron, as best we can tell, all the other elders and the leaders of the tribes were all infected. And God says, look, this time around, I want to give a demonstration to the leaders because they've been affected. In fact, if you go back and look at the earlier incident in chapter 16 at Dopka, it says there, and we read it earlier, verse 2, then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained. So there is a contagious aspect. I mean, it doesn't take very much criticism going on before it just blossoms. It just expands. It's contagious. A negative outlook, a negative spirit, a complaining individual is contagious. Somebody else is going to catch that disease, and that's bad enough, but you don't want to be responsible for that. As it filters down into chapter 16, we notice here the impact throughout the whole camp. It is, it's bad at that point. So, we've talked about the fact that criticism is constant, number one. It's contagious, number two. And the last thing that a critical spirit is, which makes it something we want to avoid at all costs, a critical spirit is contentious. Contentious. Now, let me just give you a quick definition of the word contentious. It means combative, argumentative, quarrelsome, or belligerent. Now, that's what we see at the last stop here. Again, the black arrow down at the bottom, Rephidim. Chapter 6, chapter 17, again, at the beginning. Verse 2, therefore, remember, no water at Rephidim. Therefore, the people contended with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. So Moses said to them, why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord? people had gone from complaining, just kind of under the surface, complaining, constantly complaining, never happy. It has spread. The contagion is getting worse. The attitude is getting worse to the point where they're just absolutely, at this point, the enemy of Moses. Now, read with me here. As we go on forward. And the people contended with Moses, verse 2, and said, "Give us water that we may drink." Verse 3, and the people thirsted there for the water, and the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Verse 4 says, Moses cried out to the Lord, and this is what he said, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." So they had become rebellious against Moses' leadership. This is where it ends, if it's not corrected. Notice also, back in verse 2, when Moses is speaking to them after they contended with him, he says, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" After the water had been supplied, dropping down to verse 7, it says, "So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, 'Is the Lord among us or not?'" So they went beyond criticizing God's called leadership, but they went so far as to question God. Now, that sounds really bad, but we do that all the time. In fact, every time you complain, that's what you're doing. When you complain about your circumstances and you're complaining to someone, you got to remember there's only one person responsible for your circumstances in the end, and that's God. He's a sovereign God. So all complaints ultimately are directed at him. The temptation that you put before God is to deal with you harshly. The temptation you put before God is to come down on you like a load of bricks. Now, unfortunately, there are times in life when it goes far enough, God's got to do that. But notice the grace of God here, how gracious he is, how merciful he is. That's not what he does. He just keeps supplying. Here's some water. Throw the branch in. Make it sweet. Here's the quail. Here's the manna. Pick it up. It's theirs for the picking up off the ground. Make your bread. Oh, you need water again. Here, have some water out of a rock. It's interesting in that second instance of the water, he said, "Take the rod with which you parted the sea and strike the rock." And before, when he said, "Take the branch and throw the branch in the water to make the water sweet." God is constantly, lovingly, and systematically trying to tell them, "I'm in control." It's not Moses. It's not your circumstances you need to worry about. All you need to do is just trust me. That's the message he's trying to get across. Now let's move forward and conclude all of this. Well, to me, this is the most striking part that I'm about to share with you, and I've alluded to it already a couple of times. Again, let's go back to chapter 14 and verse 10. We've already read it, but let's just put them together. Chapter 14, verse 10, right before they cross the sea. They're trapped. The armies of Israel, or armies of Egypt, are coming down upon them. The Egyptians march after them, verse 10. They were very afraid, and they cried out to the Lord, verse 10. Then in verse 11, "And they said to Moses, 'Because there were no graves in Egypt, you have taken us out here to die in a wilderness?'" Let's go over to chapter 16, verse 3. Now they're in the wilderness of sin. They're complaining they don't have enough food. Look at verse 3. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt." Let's go over to chapter 17, verse 3. No water again. And the people thirsted for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Now we read that, and we think, those ungrateful people, those ungrateful Israelites. God has rained down plagues upon Egypt. He has freed them. They're a free nation. They're headed to the promised land, the land of milk and honey. And He constantly blesses them. He parts the sea. He gives them water. He supplies their food. What is it with these people? Why can't they see it? Why can't they get it through their heads? I'll tell you why. Because they're just like we are. That's why. What did God do every time? In His grace and His mercy, He just said, "Here's what you need. Here's what you need. Here's what you need." Now, He's going to have to deal with them differently in the future, but this is the way He began with them. There's a lady on screen there. Her name is Gladys Hayward. She was a missionary to China. She left England in 1932, spent her life savings on a train ticket to take her through Russia into China. She spent her life in China as a missionary. In 1938, the Japanese invaded China, an area where she was ministering in an orphanage. And she gathered up 100+ children and took them on a journey that lasted several weeks, crossing mountains to escape from the area that was occupied by the Japanese. They were dehydrated. They were without food. They were malnourished, bleeding feet, no shoes left, exposed to the elements. And these were children from 4 and 5 years old up to 10, 12, 15. One lady leading this exodus, 1938. To give the children hope, she promised them, she said, if we can just get to the railway station at this particular place, we'll be able to get on a train, and we'll be able to travel to a city of refuge where the Japanese are not in control, and they're not a threat, and they won't kill us. They got to the railroad station. A train came along. They boarded the train. They traveled for 4 days. The train suddenly stopped. The bridge had been bombed. Could go no further. There was no escape. No way to get to where they were going. No food to eat. No promise of any relief. It's at this point that Gladys revealed later her thoughts when she wrote about him. She said she wondered if they should have left the children to die quicker, more humane death where they had been to start with, than to die as they were about to die where they were. So you see, when you realize the situation the Israelites were in, sure they had seen the power of God, but they could only see, in fact they tended to see, they were in the habit of seeing not the glory of God, not the power of God, but the problems and the challenges and the changes of life. They were walking around in a place where they didn't know where their next meal was coming from. They had little children with them. You tell me if you're not out there in the wilderness and you got a small child who's hungry that you're not going to be a little concerned? You're not going to be tempted to complain? You don't have water to drink in that environment, in that heat, where you could be dehydrated and die in a quick manner? Everything you have to lug along yourself or put it on an animal. You've got a few animals, you got some herds, and they're about to die as well. And you've never been used to that rough kind of travel or lifestyle. It wouldn't be that stretch of the imagination, would it, to put yourself in that situation, that you wouldn't be saying, Moses, why didn't you just leave us to die in Egypt? You see, that's an expression that comes from discouragement. It is a response that comes from a loss of hope. And we've all been there. We've all been discouraged. And there's been times, whether this matter or that matter, this challenge or that, we've come to a point where we have lost hope. What did Gladys do? She got off the train there at the bombed out trestle, and she took roll call of the children, and she just collapsed on the ground in discouragement and pain. She cried out to God, God, why? She cried out for a long time, and the children, from the youngest to the eldest, joined in, and they all cried. Hope was seemingly gone. What could be done? Well, Gladys did the only thing that could possibly be done in that situation. After a while of crying, she stood up. With a loud voice, she said, well, a good cry never hurt anyone. Let's sing a song. And they began to sing to God. And from singing, they began to walk. 5 more days on foot. They finally reached another train station. The only train to come by was a coal train. Not cold, C-O-L-D, coal, C-O-A-L. The only place to ride was amongst the coal. They snuggled the children in the coal and covered them up almost completely with the coal, which, by the way, camouflaged them from the Japanese planes and gave them safe journey to a place of refuge. You see, anybody can lose hope and get discouraged. But the difference between Gladys and the children of Israel is simply this. God supplied the children of Israel's needs, boom, 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 and they never learned their lesson. And Gladys trusted God in spite of having no provisions. And after a time of weakness, learned her lesson. God knew what he was doing all along. You know, Jesus said we shouldn't worry and fret about what we eat and what we drink. Matthew chapter 6. He said, let the day's own trouble be sufficient for today. We certainly have trouble every day of some sort. We have some challenges. We have something going on. But we tend to magnify in our minds what could happen, what may happen, where this is all heading, and why God allowed us to be here. And the discouragement comes in waves, and we get to a point where we might be tempted to say, Lord, why did you bring me to this place? Why didn't you just leave me alone where I was at? I was thinking about this, about some things this week. Some things I'm concerned with, things I'm concerned about. And I'm pushing things out a few years. You know, you can always find something to be concerned about, can't you? And I thought about this whole situation here. And the Lord brought this thought to my mind. If He can bring water out of a rock, if He can produce water out of a rock, He can take care of my needs as well. That's what we all got to get from this. If He can bring water from a rock, if He can feed 1 million+ people in the desert, if He can part the Red Sea, if He can bring the greatest nation on the face of the planet to its knees, He can take care of you, and He can take care of me. Don't miss the blessing by becoming an individual who has a critical spirit. Let's learn to trust Him.